Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Shawn Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. This week, we are going back to Europe, back to a time when religion was not simply a matter of personal faith, but the organizing principle of political power, the justification for war, and the lens through which every human being understood their place in the universe and their relationship to the rulers above them. A time when the specific words of a theological argument could determine whether you kept your land, your title, your freedom, your life. A time when the difference between Catholic and Protestant was not a matter of personal preference, but of political allegiance, dynastic loyalty, and mortal consequence. The year is 1618. The city is Prague, and on the morning of May 23rd, a group of Protestant noblemen are going to do something that will set off a chain of events resulting in one of the most devastating wars in European history. They are going to throw 3 men out of a window. The men will survive. They will fall approximately 70 feet from a third-story window of Prague Castle and land, depending on which account you believe, either in a pile of dung that cushioned their fall or through the miraculous intervention of angels who bore them gently to the earth. The Catholics will insist it was the angels. The Protestants will insist it was the dung heap. Both sides will immediately begin producing pamphlets arguing their version, flooding Europe with illustrated broadsheets and theological arguments about what God's involvement in the survival of these 3 men actually meant. And then, within months, the 30 Years' War will begin a conflict that will kill somewhere between 8 million and 11 million people across Central Europe, depopulate entire regions, devastate the agricultural economy of Germany for generations, reshape the political map of the continent, and fundamentally alter the relationship between religion and political authority in the Western world in ways that are still with us today. All of it triggered by 3 men going through a window. New episodes every Tuesday at 5 in the morning. Sources are always in the episode description. Let's begin. Prague Castle, May 23rd, 1618. A Tuesday morning. It is shortly after 9 o'clock, and the sun has been up for hours over the city. Prague in the early 17th century was one of the great cities of Central Europe, a city of perhaps 50,000 people, built on both banks of the Vltava River, dominated by the massive sprawl of the castle on its hill above the left bank. The castle complex was enormous, a city within a city, with churches and palaces and administrative buildings and courtyards stretching across the hilltop. It was the seat of royal power in Bohemia, and on this particular Tuesday morning, it was the location of a confrontation that had been building for months and was about to resolve itself in the most dramatic way possible. Inside the great Bohemian chancellery, the council chamber of the royal castle, a long room with high ceilings and tall arched windows that look out over the castle's inner courtyard and the rocky moat below, something is going badly wrong. The room is full of men who are very angry. On one side, a delegation of Protestant Bohemian noblemen, led by Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn, who have come to the castle this morning with a grievance and a purpose. They are dressed formally. They are armed. Their retainers wait in the corridors outside. They have been meeting for weeks, their anger accumulating with each failed negotiation, each dismissive response from the imperial administration, each day that the Protestant churches in Harab and Brumov remained closed. They have come today to confront the men they hold responsible for the systematic assault on their religious freedoms. On the other side, 4 Catholic regents, appointed by the Habsburg Emperor to govern Bohemia in his absence. 2 of them, Wilhelm Slavata and Yaroslav Martinic, are the specific targets of Protestant fury. These are not faceless bureaucrats. They are Bohemian nobles themselves, men of rank and family, But they have chosen the Habsburg side, the Catholic side, and they have been enforcing the emperor's edicts with a thoroughness that has made them the most hated men in Protestant Bohemia. The confrontation has been escalating for the better part of an hour. The Protestants have presented their grievances formally, in the legal language of the time. They have read aloud the emperor's latest letter, which arrived that very morning, and which tells them, in the measured language of imperial administration, that their complaints are noted and that they should accept the situation. The regents have attempted to delay, to defer, to suggest that the matter be referred to absent colleagues and examined at a more appropriate time. The Protestants are done with deferral. There is a moment it is always possible to identify it in retrospect, rarely possible to identify it in the moment itself when a room of angry men crosses from argument into something else, something that has decided, something that has moved past words into action. They seize Martinic first. He knows immediately what is happening. There is a tradition of this in Prague, a specific and deliberate historical tradition that every person in that room understands perfectly, and the knowledge of it is visible in his face as they lay hands on him. He begins to struggle. He calls out to God. He calls out to the Virgin Mary. He grabs at furniture, at door frames, at anything that might stop what is coming. It does not stop it. They carry him to the window. The window is open. It is a warm May morning, and the casement stands wide. Below, approximately 70 feet down, is the rocky moat of the castle. They push him through. He falls. Slavata is next. He manages to seize the window frame with both hands as they push him through, and for a few terrible seconds he holds on. His body is out the window, dangling over the empty air. His hands are white on the stone. A noblewoman named Polixena of Lobkowitz, who was present in the room, grabbed at his coat and tried to pull him back, but she was outnumbered and overpowered. His grip was pried loose finger by finger. A contemporary account describes him crying out the names of Jesus and Mary over and over as he lost his hold. He falls too. The secretary Fabricius goes last. He is not a regent, not a political target. He is a functionary, a man whose job is to be present and take notes. He happens to be in this room on this morning, and that is enough. He goes out the window after the others. All three men survive the fall. And the 30 Years' War begins. Act 1. The world that made this possible. To understand why three men going through a window in 1618 could trigger a war that would last 30 years and kill millions of people, you have to understand what religion meant in early modern Europe. Not what it means today, a matter of personal conviction, largely private, largely protected by secular law and formally separated from political power, but what it meant then, in a world that was still experiencing the most shattering intellectual and political rupture in Western Christendom since the fall of Rome. You have to understand the Reformation. In 1517, exactly 101 years before the events we are discussing, a German monk named Martin Luther posted a list of theological objections that set off a chain of events no one fully anticipated. The Protestant Reformation did not just split Christianity, it split the political order of Europe. Because in the world of early modern Europe, the religion of the ruler was the religion of the state. This was not merely custom, it was codified as law. The principle was given its Latin formulation, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. If your prince was Catholic, you were Catholic. If your prince converted to Lutheranism, you converted too, or you moved. If you could not move, or would not move, you risked everything. The implications of this principle, applied across a continent of competing principalities and kingdoms, were enormous. Religion became identical with political allegiance. To be Protestant in a Catholic state was not just an act of conscience, it was, potentially, an act of treason. To hold the wrong theological views in the wrong territory was to be a subject of suspicion, a potential enemy of the sovereign, a person whose loyalty to the state could never be fully trusted. This conflation of religious conviction with political identity produced a specific and volatile kind of tension that could not be resolved by argument or legislation alone. It could only be resolved by force, or by the exhaustion of both sides, or by a fundamental change in how people thought about the relationship between faith and governance. Europe, in 1618, had not yet achieved any of these resolutions. What it had was a series of fragile truces and carefully negotiated compromises that everyone on both sides knew were temporary. By 1618, a century of religious conflict had already scarred the continent deeply. France had endured the wars of religion, culminating in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of French Protestants were killed across the country in a few terrible days. The Low Countries were fighting a decades-long war of independence from Catholic Spain, in part over the right to practice Protestantism. England had swung from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic and back again, across successive reigns, executing people for their beliefs with each swing. The Holy Roman Empire, the loose, complicated, deeply divided federation of German and Central European territories, nominally under Habsburg rule, had reached a fragile accommodation at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Each prince could choose the religion of his territory, and his subjects would follow. It was not a good peace. It was a suspended war. Everyone involved knew it. Everyone was waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for the moment when the suspension would end. Now, Bohemia specifically. The Kingdom of Bohemia occupied roughly the territory of the modern Czech Republic, and it had its own distinctive religious history that predated Luther by more than a century. The Bohemians had their own religious reformer, Jan Hus, who had been burned at the stake as a heretic in 1415, 100 years before Luther nailed anything to any church doors. Hus had challenged the corruption of the Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope with a directness that the Council of Constance found unacceptable, and they had burned him for it. His followers, the Hussites, had fought a series of successful wars against Catholic crusaders in the decades that followed, and had established a tradition of militant Protestant resistance unlike anything in the rest of Europe. By the early 17th century, Bohemia was a majority Protestant kingdom, divided among various Protestant sects, with a Catholic minority that included the Habsburg-appointed governing class and the church hierarchy. This arrangement worked after a fashion, because successive Habsburg emperors had needed the political and financial support of the Bohemian Protestant nobility and had been willing to make concessions to get it. The most significant of these concessions was the Letter of Majesty of 1609, issued by the Emperor Rudolf II. The Letter of Majesty was an extraordinary document, one of the most generous grants of religious freedom in early modern Europe. It guaranteed Bohemian Protestants the right to practice their religion freely, to build their own churches on royal lands, to maintain their own ecclesiastical organization, and to educate their children in their own faith. The Protestant Bohemian estates had fought hard for it and valued it enormously. It was, in their understanding, a solemn and legally binding compact. Rudolf II was, by most accounts, an unusual ruler for his time. He was deeply interested in art and science and alchemy. His court in Prague attracted astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, artists and philosophers and collectors of every kind. He was eccentric, reclusive, and increasingly unstable in his later years. But he had issued the Letter of Majesty, and it had held. For 9 years it had held through the negotiations and disputes and accumulated tensions that characterized Bohemian politics in this period. And then, in 1617, the situation changed. Rudolf had died, in 1612, and his successor, Matthias, was old and childless. Matthias designated his younger cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, as heir to the Bohemian throne, and the Bohemian estates confirmed Ferdinand as King of Bohemia in 1617. The Protestant Bohemian nobility had very good reason to be alarmed about this. Ferdinand was a product of Jesuit education and intense personal Catholic piety. He had spent years methodically suppressing Protestantism in his own territories of Inner Austria, with a thoroughness that left no room for ambiguity about his intentions. He had closed Protestant churches, expelled Protestant preachers, forced mass conversions, and accepted the voluntary or forced exile of thousands of his Protestant subjects, rather than permit them to practice their faith. He had done all of this with a systematic calm that was, in some ways, more frightening than open rage. The Protestant nobility of Bohemia looked at Ferdinand and saw what was coming. They had the letter of majesty. They had their legal protections. But they had also watched what Ferdinand did to legal protections in Austria, and they understood that a document, however solemnly signed, was only as good as the willingness of the sovereign to honor it. Their fears began to materialize almost immediately. In 1617, Habsburg officials ordered the closure of Protestant churches being built in two Bohemian towns, Hrob and Brumov, on the grounds that the land on which they were being built technically belonged to the Catholic Church rather than to the Crown. The Protestants argued that the letter of majesty protected their right to build churches on royal lands, and that church lands were royal lands. The Habsburgs argued the opposite. It was, on the surface, a technical legal dispute about property definitions. Beneath the surface, it was the opening move in what every informed observer understood was a long campaign to dismantle Bohemian Protestant freedoms one precedent at a time. The Protestant nobility convened emergency assemblies. They sent petitions to the emperor. They appealed to the imperial courts. They did everything that men of their class and their time were supposed to do when they believed their rights were being violated, everything short of force, because force was the last resort, the thing you did when everything else had failed. The emperor's response, in the form of a letter delivered to the Protestant assembly on the morning of May 23, 1618, told them to accept the situation and stop making trouble. Count von Thurn read the letter aloud to the assembled nobles in the council chamber of Prague Castle, and then, with the deliberate consciousness of a man invoking history, he turned toward the regents. ACT2. The defenestration and what followed the men who came to Prague Castle that May morning were not a mob. They were nobles, educated, politically sophisticated men who had been meeting and deliberating for months, who had exhausted every legal avenue available to them, and who had arrived at the conclusion that a more direct form of communication was required. Count von Thurn was a military officer and experienced political operator. The men around him were the leading Protestant families of Bohemia, men with ancient titles, substantial estates, and everything to lose. They were not acting impulsively. They also knew their history with a precision that the regents across the room must have recognized with a specific, cold dread. The act of defenestration had specific and resonant political meaning in Prague. In 1419, Hussite reformers had thrown 7 Catholic city councillors from the windows of the new town hall, sparking the Hussite wars. That first defenestration had not been random violence. It had been a deliberate assertion that the people of Bohemia had the right and the precedent to resist Catholic authority by force when argument failed. Over 2 centuries, the defenestration had become a symbol of Czech Protestant resistance, the thing you did when the other side stopped listening. When von Thurn and his men decided to defenestrate the Habsburg regents, they were making a conscious historical reference. They were invoking 1419. They were saying, this is the same conflict, the same principle, the same right of resistance, and they were saying it in the most unambiguous language available to them, the language of a body falling through the air. The confrontation in the council chamber had lasted the better part of a morning. When the Protestant delegation arrived, with their armed retainers, filling the corridors and the anteroom with men who were clearly not there just to argue, the regents must have understood that the situation had moved beyond ordinary political negotiation. The atmosphere in the room was described by contemporaries as charged, barely contained. The charges against Slavata and Martinic were read out formally, that they were the primary agents of the emperor's anti-Protestant policies, that they had personally violated the letter of majesty, that they had betrayed the Protestant estates of Bohemia in favor of Habsburg interests. The regents attempted to respond, to delay, to suggest deferral to absent colleagues. Von Thurn was done with delay. He gave the signal, and the men closest to Martinic seized him. Contemporary accounts describe Martinic praying aloud as they carried him across the room toward the window. He called on Jesus. He called on the Virgin Mary. He grabbed at everything he could reach. None of it stopped what was happening. They pushed him through the open window, and he fell, calling out the names of God as he went, into the 70 feet of open air above the castle moat. Slavata fought harder. He managed to seize the window frame with both hands as they pushed him through, and for a few seconds he held on, his body hanging out over the drop, his hands gripping the stone. Polyxena of Lobkowitz, a noblewoman who was present in the room, threw herself at the group around him and tried to pull him back, clutching at his coat. She was outnumbered. His fingers were pried loose one by one. He fell, crying out the holy names as he went. The secretary Fabricius followed. He was not a political target, not a regent, just a man who had been present in his professional capacity. He went out the window too. All three men survived the approximately 70-foot fall. The physical explanation that historians have generally accepted is that a large accumulation of organic material, in the most likely version, horse manure from the adjacent equestrian hall, had built up below the window and cushioned the impact. Catholic propaganda insisted that angels had caught the men, and this version circulated in illustrated pamphlets across Catholic Europe almost immediately. Protestant pamphleteers responded with their own illustrated broadsheets, emphasizing the dung heap, which had a certain satisfying quality to it, the emperor's officials, saved by manure. Both versions of the story were widely believed by their respective audiences. Slavata was injured more seriously than the others. He lost consciousness at some point and required more significant assistance before he could move. But all three men were mobile within hours. Sympathizers within the castle sheltered them and helped them toward Vienna. Fabricius, according to a story that may be partially legendary, ran to Vienna so quickly to report the news that the emperor rewarded him with a title, von Hohenfall, meaning roughly, of the high fall. Back in Prague, von Thurn and his allies were already building a government. Within hours of the defenestration, a provisional authority of 36 directors had been established to govern Bohemia in opposition to Habsburg rule. Military levies were being authorized. Letters were being dispatched to Protestant princes across Europe, explaining and justifying what had been done. The act was complete. It could not be undone. The question now was, what followed? The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Act 3, Aftermath, 30 years, 8 million dead. What followed the defenestration of May 23, 1618, did not, at first, look obviously like it was going to be the most devastating war in European history. It looked, initially, like another episode in the ongoing series of religious and political conflicts that had been simmering across Europe for a century. Bohemia had revolted against Habsburg authority before. The Habsburgs had dealt with revolts before. Accommodations had been reached. But this one was different, and the difference was Ferdinand. The Bohemian estates formally deposed Ferdinand as their king in 1619 and elected Frederick V, the Calvinist Elector Palatine, a choice that immediately expanded the conflict beyond Bohemia, since Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown dragged his allies and enemies into the confrontation. Ferdinand, meanwhile, assembled the resources of the Catholic League, called in Habsburg obligations across Europe, and built a coalition that outmatched the Protestant forces arrayed against him. On November 8, 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain just outside Prague, the Catholic forces crushed the Bohemian Protestant army in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. It was the first major battle of what would become the 30 Years' War. Frederick, the Winter King, he earned that name because his reign lasted from the autumn of 1619 to the winter of 1620, fled with his family, never to return. The Protestant cause in Bohemia collapsed, with a speed that shocked even its opponents. And then Ferdinand made his intentions clear, beyond any remaining possibility of ambiguity. In June of 1621, 27 leaders of the Bohemian Protestant uprising were executed in the Old Town Square of Prague in a public spectacle that lasted several hours. Some were beheaded, some were hanged, some were subjected to torture before their execution, in accordance with the severity of their individual offenses as Ferdinand's courts had determined them. Among the executed were some of the most distinguished Protestant nobles in Bohemia, men of ancient family and long service, men who had believed, until the very end, that their legal rights and their social standing might protect them. After the executions, 12 of the severed heads were mounted on iron spikes and displayed on the Old Town Bridge Tower, one of the most prominent structures in Prague, where they remained for 10 years. Every resident of Prague who crossed that bridge for a decade, every merchant, every scholar, every churchgoer, every child passed beneath those 12 heads. Ferdinand wanted the lesson to be visible. He wanted the cost of Protestant resistance to be impossible to ignore. The lesson was received, but the war was not over. It was barely beginning. What had started as a Bohemian religious revolt became, over the following 3 decades, a pan-European catastrophe that drew in virtually every major power on the continent. Denmark intervened on behalf of the Protestant cause in 1625 and was defeated. Sweden intervened in 1630 under King Gustavus Adolphus, who was a more capable military commander than the Danes, and the Protestant forces began winning battles again. France, Catholic France, governed by the brilliant and ruthless Cardinal Richelieu, intervened in 1635 on the Protestant side, because Richelieu's priority was weakening the Habsburgs rather than defending the Catholic faith, and the logic of dynastic competition proved, in the end, stronger than the logic of religious solidarity. The war moved through Germany in waves of destruction that accumulated over decades into something that had no precedent in European experience. The armies of the early modern period sustained themselves primarily by looting the territories they passed through. There was no reliable system of military supply. Armies lived off the land, and living off the land meant burning, stealing, and destroying what could not be carried. Town after town was sacked. Agricultural land was laid waste. Populations fled before approaching armies, or were slaughtered when they couldn't flee fast enough. And behind the armies came the famines. Burnt fields do not produce wheat. Farmers who have been killed or driven off their land do not plant crops. The disruption of agricultural production across central Germany during the 30 Years' War created famines that killed as many people, or more, as the armies themselves. And behind the famines came the plague. Hungry, displaced, crowded populations in refugee settlements and besieged cities provided ideal conditions for the spread of disease. The plague moved through Germany alongside the armies, selecting the weakest, the youngest, the oldest, the most vulnerable with the indifferent efficiency that infectious disease always has in populations already compromised by hunger and violence. The numbers, when you try to state them plainly, are almost impossible to absorb. Estimates of the death toll range from 8 million to 11 million people, out of a Central European population of roughly 21 million. Some regions of Germany lost a third of their population. Some regions lost half. The city of Magdeburg was sacked in 1631, and an estimated 20,000 of its 25,000 inhabitants were killed in the assault or in the fires that followed in a single day. In a single city, a death toll that would be unimaginable in most modern conflicts. The landscape of Central Europe was, in places, literally depopulated. Villages that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Agricultural land reverted to forest. The economic effects persisted for generations. Germany in 1680 was still recovering from what had been done to it between 1618 and 1648. All of it traces back, in the most direct chain of causation that history offers us, to three men going through a window on a May morning in Prague. The war ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, a series of treaties signed at Osnabrück and Münster that settled, or at least suspended, the religious and political conflicts that had been driving the violence. The Peace of Westphalia is considered by many historians to be one of the founding documents of the modern international order. It established the principle of state sovereignty in a new and explicit way, that each state has the right to determine its own affairs, including its religious affairs, without interference from external powers. It effectively ended the idea that the Holy Roman Emperor, or the Pope, could claim authority over the internal religious arrangements of independent states. It created a framework for international relations based on negotiation between legally equal sovereign entities rather than on the dictates of a single, overarching religious or political authority. These ideas did not spring fully formed from the peace negotiations at Westphalia. They had been developing for decades, in part as a response to the experience of watching a continent tear itself apart over theological questions that were ultimately irresolvable by force. The Peace of Westphalia gave them legal form. It said, in effect, we cannot all agree on who God is or how he should be worshipped, and we have proven at enormous cost that we cannot force each other to agree. So we will agree, instead, on a framework for coexistence. This was not, obviously, a revolutionary idea when it was proposed. It was a recognition of exhaustion and necessity more than a principled philosophical breakthrough. But it was the beginning of a world in which the nation-state, rather than the church, was the primary unit of political organization, and in which the freedom of states to determine their internal religious arrangements was, at least in principle, protected from external interference. The world we live in now, the world of national sovereignty, international law, and the formal separation of church and state, is the very distant descendant of the settlement reached at Westphalia in 1648. Martinic, one of the two defenestrated regents, recovered fully from his injuries and went on to a long and successful career in Habsburg service. He lived until 1649, long enough to see the war that his defenestration had helped trigger finally end. Slavata also recovered, wrote extensively about the events of 1618. His account is one of the primary sources we have for the details of that morning in the council chamber, and served the Habsburgs until his death. Fabricius, the secretary, received his title and presumably lived out a quieter life. History did not follow him with the attention it paid to the others. The word defenestration, from the Latin fenestra, meaning window, entered the English language specifically because of what happened in Prague. Before 1618, English had no dedicated word for throwing people out of windows because the need had not arisen with sufficient frequency to require one. It has since acquired a second, metaphorical meaning. To defenestrate someone is also to remove them from power by force or decisiveness. Politicians are defenestrated by their parties. Executives are defenestrated by their boards. In modern usage, the word is usually employed with a slight comedic distance, as if acknowledging the absurdity of what it originally described. But the original meaning is still there, underneath the metaphor. 70 feet of empty air, a window frame gripped with desperate hands, fingers pried loose one by one, the names of God called out in the moment of falling, the impact, the survival, and then a war that lasted 30 years and killed 8 million people. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week.